In this lecture, we're going to take a closer look at iSCSI and the other options that we have for iSCSI within VMware before we move on to other storage types. Now you'll notice in this window here, things are looking slightly different. We've got some slightly different IP addresses on the hosts. That's because I was having some logistical issues with the ESX host that I was running my lab from, and I've decided to switch to VMware Workstation. So in that process, I've had to change some of my IP addressing. So that's why. With iSCSI and VMware, we have a few different options, really. The first one that we're using here is the iSCSI software adapter. So this is a virtual storage adapter built into the ESX host, which performs connections to iSCSI storage through the network cards that are on the server. There is, however, hardware iSCSI adapters. What those are is just a network card, but with built-in support for iSCSI at the hardware level. So that offloads the process of handling iSCSI back to the hardware inside the network adapter instead of relying upon some software running on the main CPU. So of course that gives us better performance. There are two types of hardware iSCSI adapter. There is dependent and independent. A dependent iSCSI adapter uses the VMware tools on the host to configure the storage. An independent iSCSI adapter, or initiator to give it its proper title, relies upon some third-party software or plugin to vSphere. So a dependent hardware adapter, we configure it all through the vSphere client, either on the host or on vCenter. An independent hardware iSCSI adapter, we need to use the vendor's own tools to configure the initiator. Now, unfortunately, I can't demonstrate hardware initiators in this environment. I simply don't have one in this environment. But they're very, very similar in configuration to the iSCSI software adapter. In your storage adapters, you see multiple iSCSI hardware initiators listed here. You'll see one for each network card you have that supports iSCSI hardware offload, a dependent iSCSI hardware adapter this is, of course. And when you select your network port bindings and click Add, you will only see the VM kernel adapter that is bound to that particular NIC. So let's say you've got 4 NICs in your host. Each one of those is a dependent hardware iSCSI adapter. You'll see 4 VM HBAs in here of type iSCSI, one for each NIC. And you'll need to go into your networking first, define your VM kernel NICs for iSCSI in exactly the same way here, assigning one VM kernel adapter to one physical NIC. And then in the storage adapters, and when you say network port bindings and say add, you will only see one of those adapters for each iSCSI software adapter, for each iSCSI hardware adapter that appears in this list. So it's one-to-one mapping at that point. Whether it's a hardware iSCSI adapter, a dependent hardware iSCSI adapter, or a iSCSI software adapter, you have very similar options. Now, if we take a look at the properties here on the iSCSI software adapter, let me just move this in a bit so we've got a bit more space to see these tab titles. We have a few additional options. So we can say edit. So this is really just iSCSI label. So that is what is presented to your iSCSI storage arrays as the name, and an alias, a more friendly name. We configured the alias when we did the host configuration for iSCSI, so I just set that to ESX1, and you'll probably normally leave the iSCSI name on the default. And in authentication, we say edit, we can use CHAP to authenticate to the iSCSI storage. You may need to do this in your environment. All depends upon what your storage administrator has configured on your iSCSI SAN. You may find that if the iSCSI storage is very securely protected, so i.e. that nothing can actually get to it from the outside world, you might not be using CHAP. However, chances are in a production environment you will be using CHAP. So you can configure in here the CHAP authentication. So we can say use unidirectional CHAP if required by target. So if the SAN requires it, then we'll use the details that we find here. However, if the target is quite happy to go without CHAP, it won't use CHAP. Use unidirectional CHAP unless prohibited by target. So we'll configure CHAP, we'll use these credentials that are configured here, unless the iSCSI SAN or storage array or whatever tells us that we are not allowed to use CHAP to authenticate. And then we have use unidirectional CHAP, so we will always use unidirectional CHAP. If the storage array does not support or prevents us from using CHAP, then we will not connect to it. And bidirectional CHAP is exactly that. So we authenticate to the storage array, but then the storage array has to authenticate back to us. So you can configure a name, or you can use the initiator name if you wish, and pop a secret in there, a password if you like.